Firstly, yes, my usual jumper is being washed. Secondly, if you'd like to see me typing more fictional characters, then show me by subscribing. That's often a much better judge of whether a video has gone down well. So if you'd like to see a part 2 and 3, or maybe even 4, then please subscribe. Is it possible to type fictional characters? Not really. However, some characters are written in a way that makes this easier. They are more true to life and therefore more typable. I think that Game of Thrones characters are often like this because they all have certain strengths that end up causing corresponding weaknesses, which is exactly like personality types. If you're very dutiful, not to be confused with beautiful, and honourable, you might lack the Machiavellianism you need. If you're highly political, you might not be trustworthy. If you follow your heart in the moment, you might struggle to make cold and detached decisions when you need to, and so on. This is reminiscent of personality types because you have a dominant function, which is like your main way of approaching life, and that causes the opposite inferior function to be repressed. Also, for lots of these characters, multiple types will probably fit. I'm not going to type many characters in this video, but I'll revisit it if people like it. Okay, let's start with Tywin Lannister. There are 3 types he's probably likely to be typed as. I'd say INTJ, ENTJ, and ESTJ. Maybe also ISTJ. I'm torn between 2 types. I don't think he's an INTJ. I think he's either an ENTJ or an ESTJ. Right now I'm leaning towards ENTJ, and here's why. He's obviously highly organised and structured. Robert Baratheon even has him running things for years before the Lannisters are even in power, because he's just excellent at it. With him in charge, things are well oiled, efficient and effective. He cares deeply about the symbolism of the family name and moves heaven and earth to make sure the Lannister name echoes through history and that they are a ruling family. But like so many of the characters, he has this kind of ironic flaw. Whilst putting all of his effort into the symbolism of the family, he ignores the actual family, who are all kind of completely messed up. He's more than happy to throw away traditions when needed. For example, in Westeros, guest right is an ancient and sacred tradition, and Tywin basically completely violates that and says the infamous line, "Explain to me why it's more noble to kill 10,000 men in battle than a dozen at dinner." He's a pragmatist who is deeply unsentimental. He doesn't struggle to take action at all and can adapt very easily when the circumstances change. An example would be when he needs to completely divert his plan to defend King's Landing, having to abandon his war with the Starks as a result. His inferior introverted feeling sometimes makes him very out of touch with people's motivations, especially the people in his own family, and ultimately that leads to his downfall. If he spent just a little more time truly understanding them, their feelings, their values, what drives them and motivates them, he'd have a much better handle on them as a group. So I'm leaning towards ENTJ for Tywin. Okay, next is Prince Oberyn, who was only in the show for 1 season, but it was a pretty impactful one. Flashy, flamboyant, and full of kinetic energy. He could come across like an ESTP or an ESFP, but I think he's an ESFP. He loves to indulge in physical pleasure of all kinds and is totally unrepressed in that regard. Great food and drink, great pleasures of the flesh, even something as simple as always dressing well. He can be charming, but doesn't particularly care about being that way. He's going to be himself, and if people like him, great, and if not, then he's more than down to fight them, if need be. Unlike an ESTP, who might not always know how they feel about people, Prince Oberyn knows exactly how he feels about basically everyone he encounters. He knows who he hates and why, and is certainly not shy about pointing that out directly to them. He is passionate, impulsive, principled. He goes about his aim of avenging his sister's death in a seemingly chaotic way, or perhaps even just a downright chaotic way, but does manage to get his shot at vengeance nonetheless. He's clearly not someone who is calculating all of the ramifications of his actions, because he does trust himself to figure it out in the moment. To me, his character and his storyline is the most archetypically Game of Thrones thing ever. He's a pretty heroic character, albeit in an anti-hero kind of mold. He's progressive in his views and preferences. He's very different from the often quite unpleasant characters in King's Landing, and he's fundamentally motivated by a cause that is quite easy to get behind. And because it's Game of Thrones, well, you know how that story goes. Jon Snow, I've seen him typed as an INFJ, and I really don't see that. In the books, he's very different from the show, but in the show, I think he's an ISFP. He is someone who, for want of a better phrase, follows his heart and what he feels is right in the moment, even when that is not necessarily the most logical or pragmatic approach. He's very principled and doesn't want to sacrifice his individuality or authenticity. In fact, he goes on something of a journey in that respect, where he becomes a better leader because he learns to balance his individuality, whilst also thinking about the the collective more. On one occasion, after finding out that Ned Stark has been killed, he wants to leave the Night's Watch. He's willing to essentially go against the law and the vow he made because that's what his gut instinct is telling him to do. It's a pretty rash choice, one that will have very big consequences, but in the moment, his mind is made up. Ultimately, he is talked out of it, but were it not for their intervention, he would have gone through with it. He is also a fantastic example of how this gut instinct and following what you believe is right can actually pay off in a big way. Most obviously because it actually makes him someone who people want to follow. He can be quite blind to the intentions of other people, so isn't the best political operator and also isn't the best organizer lots of the time. He is very much in the heroic archetype mold because he's excellent at adapting and reacting in the moment in chaotic and dangerous situations, yet also gets himself into those situations pretty often. I think he's clearly a high SE user since he's at his best when he's in the thick of things, as opposed to when he's planning or strategizing, which he doesn't do very well. So I think Jon Snow is an ISFP. Arya Stark, like lots of characters in the show, it's really hard to judge her personality absent of the trauma she goes through. Whatever she is, she's going to be kind of a warped version of it. She's either typed as an ISTP or an ISFP most of the time. I think she's an ISFP, which is probably the less common one to go for. To be honest with her, it's not easy to tell the difference because she's young, in very odd circumstances, and also vengeful in a way that will inevitably make her seem more cold than she naturally is. She's pretty obsessed with sword fighting, which isn't really an indicator of anything to be honest, but it is something of an SE trope in fiction. Her coldness can come across as inferior FE maybe, but I don't see it that way. She seems to display the individualism that FI DOMs have. TI DOMs are also very individual, kind of by definition, but it can be more wrapped up in their thoughts about the world, the framework they use to approach things, their reasons and their reasoning. Just like Jon Snow, and hence why I think they have the kinship they do, she is impulsive with her feelings naturally, and kind of like he does, through her experiences, gets this trained out of her to an extent. Nonetheless, her story is kind of one of her asserting her own identity, such as her time with the Faceless Men. When she leaves there, she fundamentally rejects the notion of being no one, and reasserts her identity and who she is in a very FI kind of way. She's not willing to sacrifice it because it means something to her. It is her. That might sound very obvious to FI users hearing this, but there are lots of types who will sacrifice a lot of authenticity and put their individuality aside in many situations, and won't see that as too much of a compromise. I wouldn't really argue between ISTP and ISFP because both of them fit, but I lean towards ISFP. Feel free to give me your best ISTP case in the comments below. Tywin Lannister, he's an ENTP. I actually kind of struggle to think what other type he could possibly be. His mouth gets him into and out of trouble in equal measure. He's an excellent conversationalist, debater, and a wit. He's very creative and unbridled in his interests. He's shown to be someone who wants to acquire knowledge both for its own sake and to use as a weapon. He invents some sort of contraption for Bran to use in the early episodes and loves playing the political game. At this point, he's probably one of the most famous fictional ENTPs. There isn't really much more to say. He's a character that, in true ENTP fashion, demonstrates the power of words in combination with a quick mind and enough people skills to get by, or even sometimes be charming. Jaime Lannister. Jaime might be my favourite character in the entire show for a number of reasons. He's unapologetic, carefree, and as things progress, is shown to be someone with a lot more depth than you'd first think. He's known as basically the best sword fighter in Westeros, or possibly in the entire Game of Thrones world. Well, at least for a while. He's a person of action that is always on the go, jumping into situations for the thrill and excitement of it. He's someone who's interested in doing things and experiencing things without feeling the need to philosophize about it or speculate needlessly. ESTPs have FI as their so-called blind spot function, which means that they can appear to be, or sometimes just actually be, unaware of their own values. He's known as a man without honor or without principle, and he likes to point out how, in most cases, the person accusing him of that is hypocritical. Like his brother Tyrion, he can be extremely quick with his logic in conversation. He doesn't have much direction or overall aim or even ambition really, but over time he starts to think about his legacy more. Action oriented, in the moment, adaptable, pretty charming when he wants to be, logical, not really planning for the long term or trying to predict the consequences of his actions in the moment. I think he's an ESTP. Again, he's a person who is typed as many different things. Generally an EP type though. Okay, Littlefinger. Littlefinger is a difficult character to type. I'm not saying that he's overpowered exactly, but he's kind of like a supercharged, intuitive dom. But what kind of intuition is it? To me, he has to be a dominant NI or dominant NE user. Let's rule out ENFP. So INFJ, INTJ, or ENTP. Could I see him being an INFJ who manipulates people primarily to achieve his ends? Yes, I could, but it doesn't really fit that well to me in the portrayal in the show. He is like the archetypical behind-the-scenes mastermind who's pulling the strings. It's actually remarkable how much of the plot in the show is because of actions that he has taken, and none of the other characters realize it. That being said, he's so not reckless purpose, exactly, but risk-taking in a way that is very un-INTJ-like. INTJs can do well in chaos because they'll start to create order out of it, but they generally won't want to bring it about in the way that he wants to. He's almost sometimes philosophically attached to chaos in the way the Joker is. He feels like he has a competitive advantage in situations of chaos. He often takes actions just to throw people off and confuse them. He loves playing the game. Yes, he does have a singular vision about sitting on the Iron Throne, but that's kind of the case for everyone who is near it. I have one of his quotes here where he says, "Don't fight in the north or the south, fight every battle, everywhere, always." In your mind. Everyone is your enemy, everyone is your friend. Every possible series of events is happening all at once. That is psycho ENTP talk to me. I think that in the show, he's an ENTP, or at least that's a good fit. He's too much of an improviser, risk taker, and positional chess player. He loves to have options and possibilities that he can select at any time. He plays with people a lot and simply changes a lot. He's quite changeable. I don't see him suffering from the blind spot FE issues that an INTJ would have. He reads people very well and can do that back and forth with them pretty seamlessly. He also does that typical ENTP thing of just talking too much and getting into trouble for it. If you think Littlefinger is an INTJ, let me know. And especially if you think he might be an INFJ, I'd be very curious to hear that reasoning as well. Okay, Varys. Varys and Littlefinger are like two different philosophical schools of thought in the story. Littlefinger is out for his own personal power and is a force of chaos, whereas Varys is about the realm and wants there to be order and stability. His method of going about this is by building networks of people. He's known as the Spider, and his web is that human network or human system. He's a person who deals in information and managing these different threads, these relationships. He has this very abstract notion of the realm, which he himself acknowledges is not a literal thing, but is something that emerges from this kind of mutual agreement that order and stability are desirable for all involved, even when people have competing interests. I think he's an INFJ. He definitely, like Littlefinger, has to be an intuitive dominant type, and although he's pretty adaptable and seemingly slippery, he tends to be carrying out very particular plans at various points in the story. You rarely see him getting into arguments with people or stirring the pot. He's a subtle, soft-spoken, and quiet behind-the-scenes operator who has his finger on the pulse of every single important relationship and connection in the Seven Kingdoms. I can see why he'd come across like an INTJ or even other thinking types, but he's too people and relationship focused for that to fit. I've seen him typed as an ENFP before, and that's quite a poetic difference of Littlefinger being an ENTP and him being an ENFP, but I'm still leaning towards INFJ. Okay, Jorah Moment, great character. He's someone who has an encyclopedic knowledge of the world. He's someone who has taken his experiences and really milked the knowledge and insights gained from them. He's a wise character and therefore an excellent advisor. He has the stereotypical supporting role that is often associated with ISFJs, and similarly, he's in many ways the driving force behind Daenerys. He's very good at predicting people's reactions to things and will often factor that into his decisions and his advice. He's skeptical of extremely bold and new ideas, which creates this cool dynamic between him and Daenerys, where he's cautioning her against going too far, too fast. He is extremely stable, dependable, and loyal. One of my favorite characters in the show, and like so many of them, very well cast. I think he's a good fictional example of an ISFJ. It occurred to me that there's a lot of characters in this show. I'll probably call this part 1. If you want to see more of these videos, part 2, 3, 4, and typing fictional characters from other shows and universes, then please subscribe as opposed to just liking and commenting. Although, feel free to do all 3.